Unit 5B. Should you believe a statistical study? Now, remember, statistics is a great way for society to develop policy, develop laws. But unfortunately, statistics, although it is a science and it is a mathematical science that can be used for the greater good, unfortunately, there are statistics out there that are abused and potentially misused just to prove some sort of point or to prove some sort of agenda. So many times we'll have to think back to our chapter 1 days when we learned about um, fallacies and things like that. Statistics aren't always believable. So in this section, in this lesson, you'll learn about whether or not you should believe a statistical study, and basically, before you believe numbers that are in the internet or in the news, should you actually believe them? Is it actually worth your time? So now we know that most statistical research is generally carried out with integrity and care. However, there are times where even the most flawless uh, tests and data are biased, and bias can arise in many ways. So these following guidelines are going to help us understand whether or not you should believe one. So if you ever come across a statistic in your life, please follow these guidelines and ask yourself these questions, and try to make sure that you are not swayed to either way based off of bias, but you are swayed based off of fact and um, you know genuine statistical research. So number one, the first guideline I would like to point out is what was the goal of the study? Ask yourself, like, what was the goal? Like what were they trying to figure out in the particular study you're looking at? And what population were under study? For example, we'll do an example later where if you ask a specific question with certain populations, I'm pretty sure you'll know that they'll answer differently than other populations. For example, what if I were to ask a question about, let's say, healthcare to people that were millionaires? Well, I think we all could agree that millionaires would have a different view on healthcare than opposed to, let's say, people who make, less than $50,000 a year. So that's the thing, is that you'll have to kind of look at the population and was the population clearly and appropriately defined for that study. There are obviously studies that it would be appropriate to only ask millionaires, and there are studies that would only be appropriate to only ask um, poor people living in at or below the poverty line. But clearly, when it comes to things like healthcare and who you're going to vote for, would be more appropriately defined in a more broad sense. Now, also ask yourself the question, was the study observational or an experiment? If it's an experiment, was it single or double blind? If you recall, we talked about double blind being typically the best way to go, because if it's double blind, both the folks taking the treatment or having the treatment, the control group, and the control group that does not get the treatment, it's good that both the people conducting the experiment and the folks that are being treated are basically not knowing who has treatment and who doesn't. Also, consider the source. What was the statistical study based off of? Based off of something that was subjective, or was it based off something objective, or was it purely biased? Also, look for selection bias. That occurs whenever researchers specifically look for their sample in a way that actually makes it underrepresentative of the population. Participation bias occurs primarily when surveys and polls. It arises whenever people choose whether to participate. People feel who is strongly about an issue are more likely to participate, and then let's say there's people that are not as don't feel as strongly, so they might not participate. It's kind of like whenever you go to Yelp and you look at the ratings on Yelp, Many times, the people on Yelp, they like to kind of complain and gripe about specific restaurants because it gives them, drive, and it actually causes them to feel strongly. So they'll go on to Yelp and complain. So that might pull down the ratings a little bit further than what they should be because they have bias, not because they want to state facts. Also, look for problems in defining or measuring variables of interest. So the variable is any item or quantity that can vary or take on different values. Variables of interest in a statistical study basically are, they seek to actually measure things, but also make sure you can define what they're actually trying to study, like what variables are trying to be studied. We'll do an example later of what this means. For example, right here, this is going to help us with the variable studies. What if law enforcement were to say that, hey, they stop about 10 to 20% of the illegal drugs entering the United States? So what if you read a story in the news that say, hey, authorities succeed in stopping only about 10 to 20% of the illegal drugs? Well, should you believe this statistic? Well, first, let's go ahead and take a look at what are our variables here. Our first variable is the quantity of illegal drugs that are intercepted. So obviously, you can count that quantity is easily found because they do a raid, they confiscate the drugs, and they can count up how many or how much they can weigh or measure how much drugs was confiscated in that raid. However, what's harder to do is the quantity of illegal drugs that are not intercepted. I've seen a few movies out there and documentaries on the illegal drug trafficking that was going on back in the 80s. And a lot of drug cartels were sending drugs to the United States for the purposes of being intercepted by police officers. And police officers would think, oh, wow, we're actually making a lot of progress, confiscating these drugs. Meanwhile, through some other back door or back alley, the same drug cartel, while they were distracting the police with their drug raid, they were importing, a vast amount more of illegal drugs into the country without the police knowing. And obviously, as a question, do you ever think illegal drugs were reported willingly? Do you think drug cartels, go ahead and anonymously or otherwise tell them, hey, this is how many, kilos of cocaine we smuggled into the country? No, obviously not. So, obviously, no one would, in the right mind, would report illegal drugs, let alone any kind of illegal activity. Therefore, this statistic should not be trusted. In fact, it could be a lot worse than this. It could be they've only been stopping 1 to 2%. They're being a little optimistic. It could also be that they're being conservative, and maybe it's perhaps a little bit more on a more good. If let's say they're doing a lot of raids and they're finding a lot of illegal drugs, but unless the illegal drugs are reported, as far as the total, this could not be trusted. Obviously, drug cartels would not be honest about this sort of thing. Another guideline: beware of what are known as confounding variables. These are variables that are not intended to be part of the study, but sometimes find their way into the results. And, such confounding variables confuse the study's results. Guideline 6. What about the wording? What about how it is worded? I remember a few years back, I was voting for a particular proposition. I don't quite remember which one it was, but I remember reading about it, and I wanted to vote either yes or no. Let's say I wanted to vote yes when I walked into the booth, but then when I actually read the proposition again, just one last time in the voting booth, the way they worded it made me want to vote no, even though my studies and my research told me that I should vote yes. And it's because they actually were a little bit dishonest, in my opinion, with the wording of the proposition when I went to vote, because they were trying to actually get people to vote a certain way. So also remember, whenever you're reading a statistical study, read the setting and the wording. because they could be actually being a little bit dishonest just to get your attention and maybe even stoke up some emotion or stoke up some sort of response. So, for example, take a look at this one. Let's say we go to the Republican National Committee, and despite whatever you think of Republicans, if whether you are one or not, they commissioned a poll to find out whether Americans supported their proposed tax cuts. And they asked the question, do you favor a tax cut? And the large majority of them said yes. Should we conclude that Americans support the proposal? Well, once again, the question, do you favor a tax cut, is a very biased question, especially within certain groups. And, Republicans are historically known for being in favor of tax cuts. So obviously, if they're going to go ahead and conduct a poll to only Republicans, the vast, vast, vast majority are going to answer, yes, we support tax cuts. So obviously, we should not conclude that Americans support the proposal just because they are asking a very biased question to a very biased group. So the question should be asked. I still think it's a very important question to ask, but I believe it should be reworded and maybe even sent out to a broader audience to avoid bias. Another guideline is check that the results are presented fairly. Sometimes studies misrepresent using graphs, and that's never good. Sometimes researchers might misinterpret the results or jump to conclusions and not support the results that are given to them, and then make their own graph or visual presentation. So for example, look at this here. Let's say a school board in Boulder, Colorado created quite a fluster amongst the parents when it announced that 28% of Boulder school children were reading below grade level, and hence concluded that methods of teaching the way to read needs to be changed. The announcement was based on the reading test, which 28% of the Boulder school children scored below the national average for their grade. Do these data support the board's conclusion? Well, the problem is, though, is that the conclusion is that the teaching methods need to be changed. It's not justified by this data because they're presenting it to us in kind of a biased way, in a way that isn't really representing the situation well. Because if you think about it, they're only pointing out the bad side of the below grade level. They're only saying, hey, 28% of school children are reading below grade level, but 28% out of 100, which tells you what? That 72%, if you subtract the 28 from 100, that means 72% of Boulder children are reading above grade level, at or above grade level. So that means that they're kind of discounting the fact that quite a large majority of Boulder school children are reading above school level. Again, 72% is above school level. Therefore, this is not justified by the data. Finally, Guideline 8, ask yourself the following questions. Did the study achieve the goals it set out to achieve? And also, do the conclusions make sense? So, asking yourself these questions is going to become very important because in doing so, you can actually, come up with potential or alternative explanations for the results. If the conclusions don't quite make sense, or if the study doesn't quite achieve its goals, you're going to have more alternative explanations. But if it does achieve its goals and the conclusions do make sense, you can start ruling out any alternative explanations of the results. Now, if the conclusions do make sense, do they have any sort of practical significance? So sometimes the statistical study might be completely true, might be a totally flawless study with perfect data, but you still might be wasting your time. What if you're doing or reading a statistical study that has nothing to do with your life, practically speaking, or has nothing to do with your family's life, practically speaking? Then, you have to ask yourself the question, okay, fine, maybe the statistical study makes sense and it's right, but it really doesn't have any relevance to my life. So you also have to look at that standpoint. Is it practical? So, for example, this one right here. So, imagine you have an experiment that takes the weight losses of people who try what's called the new fast diet supplement, which is some sort of product that is compared to the weight losses of a control group of people who try to lose weight in other ways. So, like, let's say the other folks use exercise or whatever. Now, after 8 weeks, the results show that the treatment group lost an average of a half a pound more than the control group. Assuming that it has no dangerous side effects, does this study suggest that the fast diet supplement is a good treatment for people wanting to lose weight? Well, I mean, a lot of people that are trying to lose weight, are usually significantly overweight. So my question to you in this case is, does 1/2 pound really matter? Now, maybe it's true that maybe everything on here is flawless, right? Okay, this statistical study is completely flawless, let's assume, and let's say that the people that are using the fast diet supplement do truly lose about an average of 1/2 pound more than the people who tried other methods. But does it really matter? And not only that, how expensive is this product? I mean, if it was super expensive, do you really care about being a 1/2 pound heavier than your friends who never used the product at all? If it's really expensive, it's not going to be worth it. It's not practical. But even forget aside from that, even if it was a cheap supplement, again, 1/2 of a pound really does not compare to losing 20, 30 pounds. 1/2 a pound really does not matter. Anyway, this concludes the lesson for 5B. Please send your questions my way if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from you soon if you need help. Have a great night.